You heard it said that unexamined life is not worth living. And I can't think of a way to examine life without at some point making a reference to God. You know, when all the parts are moving, you want to find someone or something that is immovable. Something by which you can measure life. Someone who is a standard for how we can determine what is right, what is wrong. So here we are in the midst of pandemic, COVID-19. And sooner or later, it is hard to get away from the question, what did God intend through this? You got to ask that question because this pandemic is unlike all the other calamities that come our way. Usually when something happens in the world on a large scale, it brings people together. You know, when an earthquake collapses our life into a pile of rubble, we all get out there to help each other. People bond together. They try to work together to help people who perhaps are buried underneath, all the debris. When flood comes, we run away to high places. We share things we have. We are together. But what's peculiar about this crisis is that it forced us into isolation. The whole world has been sequestered. Here we are in the loneliness of our own homes, locked away, each in our own room, just with the very people that are nuclear families or maybe closest friends, apart from everybody else. That's what makes this crisis unique. So it's hard not to think, what does God intend through this? I think that the best way to think yourself to clarity about what God may intend through something is to begin by thinking about who God is. When you pause for a moment, when God came to pitch a tent among us, as John mentions in his gospel, he twice repeats that what left an indelible impression on him, that when God came, he came with grace and truth. God is gracious, and that means he's loving. He always does what is his best for us. So when he enacts things in the world, he doesn't do it because he hates us. It's precisely the opposite. His grace gives us countless chances to get back on track after we went off course. He does whatever he can to give us that second chance after we have blown it time and again. That's grace. But then there's that side of truth that sets God apart from all other deities. And that means that God is faithfully trying to help us to get squared with what is and what ought to be, in place of the constant fictions that we create. He doesn't want us to fall for a fiction that then creates propaganda and gets us to live a lie. So you know that much, that when God brings out these calamities, and in this particular case, the pandemic, he does it because he intends to help us to get back onto the path of truth that actually leads to life rather than death. And then what also helps to figure out what God might be doing is not only to reflect on who God is, but what God does. And what you can discover from the record of what God has done through history is that when he meets people who are perpetually trying to go their own way, he eventually gives us what we want. You remember that story of a mother being busy in the kitchen. Now she's preparing supper after a long day, and the father's playing with the toddler in the living room. All she hears from the living room is the young kid crying, "Gimme, gimme, 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 gimme." And she's exhausted by it, so finally she yells to the husband, "Why don't you give him what he wants?" There's a moment of pause. And there's a blood-curdling shriek, and the kid is yelling at the top of his lung, crying. The mother rushes into the living room, and she says, "What did you do?" The husband says, "Well, I gave him what he wanted." What did he want? Well, he wanted to play with a bumblebee. Sometimes when we want something, we will not say no. God gives us what we want. Notice that this peculiar crisis has forced us into what the media calls social distancing. You know, in public, you're supposed to stand at least 2 meters apart. But I think that's just physical distancing. The social distancing has been happening for a while now. If you look at our lives, what we've been wanting is to create a world of our own imagination. We have detached from life with the people closest to us, the relationships that we have within the reach of our hands, and we have instead have chosen to become exiled by technology because we can create a world in which we can detach from everything and everyone else. We've been doing this for a while. You know, you've got your video games. You spend hours in the basement suite of your parents' home. You're 35. You know, your life's going nowhere, but in those games, you're a hero. That's why you escape into the darkness, so you can get the feeling of accomplishment while nothing else is going on in life. And you actually don't need anyone around you. You can just play it in the isolation of your own apartment, you know, your own basement suite. And then in those difficult relationships with people that never work out, you know, marriages that cause tension, we have pornography to escape to. You know, they can find a woman that will do whatever you want, and, you know, unlike the people who are you in relationship with. And then you have your favorite playlist. You stream your favorite content from YouTube. We've been doing this for years, step by step, by means of the technology that enable us to create the worlds of our own imagination. We have come to live in virtual reality that never touches actually the road of life. So that 2 meters of physical isolation, the physical distancing, is just a result of the social isolation that has been taking place in our lives now for some years. Perhaps God has given us what we wanted. You know, we wanted to be alone, so He finally put us in our living room, and you can do whatever you want. You know, you don't have to be embarrassed about it. The media are telling us now that we're streaming media through the internet 8 hours a day. Everybody's doing it. You can escape into your own world. Nobody will hold you accountable for it. But the more of it you have, the more of a sense you get how empty and vacuous it all is, don't you? And you know, you gotta wonder about it, because there's a third thing about God that's worth realizing, and that is that what God does and what happens in the world at large is on a collision course with itself. You see, the world out there is turning counter-God-wise. So what the world intends is often exactly opposite to what God has in mind. You know, people there are trying to get us isolated from each other for fear that we may contract disease. But what if God wants us isolated because we're sick, deathly ill in our souls? So what the world intends for isolation, God intends for solitude. And solitude is not just about escaping from something. It's escaping for something. In the past, when people went into solitude, it was to take stock of their lives, to reflect on life's meaning. What if God put us in solitude so that we finally have a time to get what we wanted to overflowing. Until that virtual world saturates our lives and we're sick of it and we realize the emptiness of it. A few years ago, I spent about a year in Canadian oil fields. I was up north in the middle of nowhere. I was operating a combo truck, which meant that I would drive for an hour or two to a place, and by regulations I just had to sit there in the truck with the diesel engine rattling. I would sit there for 10, 12, 14 hours sometimes. And I would go back to the camp. I was out for 2 weeks and back for a week at home. You know, when you sit there by yourself with no access to media, out of range of the phone, or anything can stream from the internet, you're forced to reflect on your life. Start to think about who you are, and you discover that over the years, through all that stuff that comes at you, you just become an amalgam of things you never wanted to become. You discover you hold contradictory convictions, thoughts that actually battle with each other, and you didn't even know that you believe these things that don't fit together. You notice that media that bypasses your intellect and wants to evoke emotions has left you with just a bundle of emotions where you go from happiness to despair, and you really have no idea why. And you've lost the ability to communicate because you can't work your way through an argument. You just evoke those emotions, and then we keep on screaming at each other across a chasm because we're just expressing whatever's going on the inside, and we don't know why. Ultimately, sitting there by yourself, you realize that all these years of pursuing fiction out there through media and video games, there's infinite value in relationships with these people that you bypass every day. So maybe we're making a mistake. I think especially in the context of God's people, to try to rescue people from that solitude into which God has plunged us, trying to rescue them by streaming more, trying to come up with advice. I know this sounds like hypocrisy, because here I am talking to you, and believe me, it's just the tip of my iceberg of hypocrisy. But maybe it would have been better for us to leave people in their solitude, so they have time to think themselves to clarity about who they are, what they're living for, and how they can love other people. Try this. Once I'm finished talking at you, I'm sorry, you can always cancel me out. We live in that culture. Turn everything that's coming at you off and just sit there for a moment in total silence. And perhaps for the first time in your life, you will overhear the beat of your own heart. And if you sit there a moment longer, you will begin to hear that whole sound that comes from the emptiness of your mind. You realize that you don't know what to think about, because you don't know how to think anymore. And if you sit there long enough, perhaps you will hit the rock bottom of that self-introspection, where you'll find you realize that maybe this was and is the best opportunity that God has given us. To think ourselves to clarity about who we are, what we're living for, and how we can love again.